Imani Rousseau checked her reflection one last time before the ballroom doors opened, smoothing the emerald silk over her hips, and told herself that tonight she finally looked like the woman standing beside Julian Cross deserved to look. The Cross and Whitfield 10th anniversary dinner was the kind of event Julian lived for, a room full of judges and donors, and the kind of Atlanta old money that decided who got to run for office and who didn't, and Imani had spent 3 weeks designing every inch of it herself, from the gold-rimmed place cards to the orchid centerpieces that matched the cufflinks she'd given Julian for their 5th wedding anniversary. She was good at this. She built rooms that made people feel important, and for 10 years she had built a marriage the same way, quietly, carefully, absorbing every comment about her body with a practiced smile, because Julian always said the same thing afterward, that he loved her exactly as she was, that the whispers didn't matter because he knew the truth. She believed him until the doors opened and she saw Vanessa Hale on his arm. Vanessa was Julian's campaign strategist, 31, whip-thin, dressed in white like she'd been invited to be the centerpiece herself, and for one long second, Imani thought there had to be an explanation, a seating mix-up, a work emergency that required Julian's attention before dinner. Then Julian took the microphone from the string quartet's stand, tapped it twice, and smiled the smile he used for cameras. He thanked everyone for 10 years of friendship and support. He thanked his law partners. He thanked the mayor's office. And then he turned to Imani, still smiling, and told 200 of Atlanta's most powerful people that he was filing for divorce, effective immediately, because he had finally found a partner who matched the life he was building instead of holding him back from it. Nobody moved. Somewhere near the bar, a glass touched a tray too hard, and the sound cracked through the silence like a slap. Imani's mind went, absurdly, to the seating chart still folded in her clutch. 42 tables she'd spent 3 sleepless nights arranging, so no 2 feuding donors would end up within earshot of each other, and she thought, with the strange sideways clarity that shock sometimes brings, that she had planned for every possible disaster in this room except the one actually happening. 10 years of marriage had trained her to read Julian's moods before he spoke them. The tightness at his jaw that meant a case had gone badly, the particular silence that meant he wanted to be left alone, and she had missed this entirely, missed the months of late nights recast, now in a single sentence, as something other than the campaign work he'd claimed, missed every dinner where Vanessa's name had come up a little too often to be nothing. She had built her whole marriage the way she built other people's ballrooms, managing every variable, softening every rough edge, making sure the room around Julian always looked exactly the way he needed it to look, for the cameras and the donors, and the version of himself he was constructing one election cycle at a time. She had told herself that was love. Standing under 200 pairs of eyes while he explained, calmly, into a microphone, that she was the rough edge he'd finally decided to smooth away, she understood for the first time how much of that love had only ever run in one direction. She had met Julian 12 years earlier at a fundraiser she'd been hired to coordinate, a young public defender back then, sharp-suited and ambitious in a way that had felt magnetic instead of alarming, and he'd spent that whole evening finding excuses to cross the room and talk to her, instead of the donors he was supposed to be courting. He told her, early on, that he'd never dated a woman who looked like her before, meant, she'd believed then, as a compliment about her confidence, rather than a warning about how conditional his attraction would eventually prove to be. She married him 2 years later, believing she'd found a man secure enough not to need a certain kind of woman on his arm to feel like he'd won something. For a long time, that belief held. Julian complimented her in front of colleagues, defended her once, loudly, at a law firm dinner when a senior partner made a crude joke at her expense, and Imani had built a decade of trust on evenings like that one, not realizing that the defense had less to do with protecting her than with protecting his own image as a man secure enough to have a wife people whispered about. The ambition that first drew her to him had simply taken longer than she expected to curdle into something that needed a different kind of ornament once the stakes climbed high enough, and by the time it curdled all the way, she'd spent 10 years too invested in the marriage to see it happening in real time. Julian didn't apologize. He didn't lower his voice or pull her aside or spare her the specifics. He said the word everyone had been too polite to say to her face for a decade, said it slow so it would land, said a wife who let herself go couldn't be the face of a governor's campaign, and Vanessa had the decency to at least look at the floor while he said it, which was more decency than Julian showed at all. Imani stood in the middle of the room she had built, in the dress she had chosen to feel beautiful in, and felt every eye in the ballroom weigh exactly as much as his words did. She didn't cry. She wanted to, badly, but some old survival instinct took over instead, the one that had gotten her through every room that ever measured her by inches instead of achievements, and it walked her calmly to the coat check, past people who wouldn't meet her eyes, out through the lobby, and into the cold Atlanta night without her coat, without her purse, without a single word to the husband who had just ended their marriage in front of everyone who mattered to him. She didn't know how long she walked. Streetlights blurred into each other, heels forgotten in her hand somewhere around the third block, bare feet numb against the pavement, and every time her mind tried to replay Julian's face at that microphone, she forced it somewhere else. Anywhere else, until she looked up and realized she'd walked herself into a part of Midtown she didn't recognize, past shuttered storefronts, and an alley where 3 men were watching her get closer, with the particular attention of men who had already decided what they wanted. Imani's stomach dropped. She turned to walk back the way she came, and one of them was already moving to cut her off, close enough now that she could smell the liquor on him, close enough that running wasn't going to be a choice she got to make. The first man reached for her wrist, and Imani jerked back so hard she stumbled off the curb, one bare heel catching against a storm drain, and for one long, airless second she was certain she was about to find out exactly how much worse this night could still get. Headlights swept the alley white, and a black car eased to the curb like it had been summoned rather than arrived, and out of it stepped a man in a charcoal suit who didn't so much as raise his voice to make all 3 men freeze where they stood. He said something short in Korean over his shoulder, and 2 men Imani hadn't even noticed materialized from the car behind him, and whatever the 3 men in the alley saw in those 4 faces was enough to send them walking fast in the opposite direction without a word of protest. The man in the charcoal suit turned to Imani like the last 90 seconds hadn't happened at all, offered his hand, and asked in unhurried English if she was hurt. That was how Imani Rousseau met Baek Hyun-woo, barefoot and shaking, and still wearing the wreckage of her marriage on her face, and the first thing she noticed, once her heart stopped hammering, was that he never once looked down at her body the way every man in that ballroom had spent a decade looking at it. He looked at her face. He looked at her hands, checking for injury. He looked, briefly, at the busy street behind her like he was already calculating threats she hadn't thought to consider. He didn't ask what had happened to her. He simply told his driver to bring the car around, gave her his jacket without being asked, and said he would take her wherever she needed to go, and something about the flat certainty in his voice made refusing feel unnecessary. She gave him her sister's address because she couldn't stomach the thought of walking back into the house she still shared with Julian, and for the 15 minutes it took to get there, Hyun-woo didn't ask a single question she didn't want to answer. He only asked, once, quietly, if someone was expecting her, and when she said no one was, something flickered across his face that she was too raw to read. At her sister's door, he handed her a card with nothing on it but a phone number, told her to call if she needed anything at all, and was gone before she'd even found the words to thank him properly. She didn't expect to see him again. Men like that, she assumed, collected rescues the way other men collected watches and forgot the faces attached to them by morning. She was wrong, though she wouldn't understand exactly how wrong for another 2 weeks. Have you ever felt betrayed, rejected, and felt left out just because of your size? Hit that subscribe button if you need a rescue such as this. Tell me where you're watching from. Like and share this story as we dive deeper. The divorce moved fast once Julian filed, faster than Imani had energy to fight, and the 2 weeks that followed blurred into a grim rotation of packing boxes at the house, ignoring calls from mutual friends who wanted the details, and standing in front of mirrors picking apart every inch of herself that Julian's speech had given the whole city permission to critique out loud. She stopped eating some days entirely and ate everything in sight on others, and both felt like punishment, and both left her exactly as hollow. Her sister Denise finally sat her down on a Sunday and told her the truth nobody else would, that Julian hadn't left her because of her body, he'd left her because his ambition needed a different kind of ornament, and the body had just been the cruelest excuse available to him. Imani heard the words. She didn't believe them yet. Belief would take longer than 2 weeks, longer than Denise's patience, longer than Imani wanted to admit. It was Denise, in fact, who noticed the black car parked across the street 3 separate times that week and asked Imani, only half joking, if she had a bodyguard now. She didn't, as far as she knew, but the following Friday her phone rang from an unknown number, and Hyunwoo's voice on the other end asked, without preamble, if she'd eaten dinner. She hadn't, not really, and something about the bluntness of the question, no performance in it, no pity, made her laugh for the first time in 2 weeks. He picked a restaurant she'd never have chosen for herself, quiet, unpretentious, the kind of place where nobody photographed the tables, and for 2 hours he asked her nothing about Julian at all. He asked about her business instead, the event company she'd built from nothing over 8 years, the ballrooms and weddings and galas she designed for people who never once asked who had built the room around them, and he listened like her answers actually mattered, which nobody had done in a very long time. Denise wasn't as easily charmed. She showed up at Imani's door the morning after that first dinner, with 2 coffees and a look that had gotten Imani through every bad decision of both their 20s, and asked, point blank, whether her baby sister had lost her mind, going to dinner with a man who kept armed men in a car outside her house. Imani didn't have a clean answer for her. She only knew that for 2 hours the night before, nobody had looked at her plate to see how much she was eating. Nobody had steered the conversation toward her weight loss goals disguised as concern for her health, and nobody had made her feel, even once, like her body was the main event of the evening instead of an afterthought to it. Denise softened, eventually, the way she always did, and admitted that whatever else was true about this stranger, he'd noticed something about Imani that Julian had stopped noticing years before either of them realized it was gone. He'd noticed she was tired. He'd noticed the flinch that crossed her face whenever anyone raised a phone to take a picture at an angle she couldn't control. Small things, the kind of things a decade of marriage should have made automatic, and hadn't. The dinners kept happening after that, once a week and then twice, always at restaurants without cameras, always ending with Hyunwoo walking her to her car and never once trying to close the distance between them, which frustrated Imani more than she wanted to admit by week 6. She found herself looking forward to Thursdays with an intensity that scared her a little, given that her divorce hadn't even finalized yet, given that the ink on 10 years of marriage was barely dry enough to smudge. She asked him, eventually, why he'd been parked outside her sister's house. He didn't lie to her, which she'd learn later was rare for him. He told her plainly that his security team had flagged concerns after the alley, that men who behaved the way those 3 had didn't always give up after one bad night, and that he'd wanted eyes on her until he was certain she was safe. It was a careful answer. It was also, she'd realize much later, an incomplete one, because Hyunwoo Baek did not personally involve himself in the safety of strangers, not even frightened ones he'd rescued from alleys, unless something else had already put her on his radar. That something else had a name, and its name was Cross and Whitfield. For now, though, Imani only knew that a devastatingly handsome, quietly dangerous man kept finding reasons to check on her, and that his checking on her felt nothing like Julian's decade of careful, conditional love. It felt like being seen, not measured. Julian resurfaced 2 weeks after that first dinner, calling from a number Imani hadn't blocked yet, his voice carrying the particular warmth he used for donors he needed something from. He wanted to talk, he said, properly this time, away from lawyers and paperwork, and against her better judgment, Imani agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near her old office, curious despite herself about what 4 weeks of silence had apparently taught him. It hadn't taught him anything about her. It had taught him that her name still opened doors his campaign needed opened, that half the vendors and donors he'd courted through their marriage had been her relationships first, cultivated over years of events she'd designed and he'd merely attended, and that dissolving the marriage cleanly, without her goodwill, was costing him more than he'd anticipated when he'd stood at that microphone. He didn't apologize for the dinner. He barely mentioned it, framing it instead as a mistake in delivery rather than in substance, and suggested, with a straight face, that they could handle the divorce more amicably if she was willing to make a few introductions on his behalf before the papers finalized. Imani sat across from the man she'd spent 10 years building a life around and felt, for the first time since that ballroom, something close to clarity instead of grief. He hadn't come to apologize. He had come to collect, the same way he always had, treating her as an asset to be managed rather than a person he'd wounded, and she understood, watching him talk, that if she said yes to a single one of his requests, she'd be right back in the role she'd spent a decade playing, smoothing his path forward at whatever cost to herself. She told him no, calmly, and watched the warmth drain out of his face the instant he realized the coffee shop meeting had cost him nothing but time. He tried anger next, an old, familiar tactic, reminding her that she owed her entire client list to the connections his name had opened for her, and Imani, surprising herself, laughed, because for the first time she could see clearly that the opposite had always been true. She had built the connections. He had only ever borrowed them. She left the coffee shop lighter than she'd walked in and told Hyunwoo about it that Thursday over dinner, not because she needed his protection, but because for the first time in a long while she had someone worth telling. He listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and told her only that she'd handled it exactly the way a woman who no longer needed Julian's approval would, which was, she realized, precisely true. 3 weeks in, she asked to see where he trained, half daring him, half needing something to do with the anger that had replaced her grief. Hyunwoo owned a private gym above one of his clubs downtown, all exposed brick and mirrors and heavy bags that had clearly taken a beating, and he trained there most mornings before the city woke up, discipline etched into every line of a body that had clearly been built through years of purposeful, punishing work. He offered to show her a few things. She showed up the next morning in workout clothes that made her feel exposed in a way she hadn't expected, and braced herself for the same look she'd gotten in every gym she'd ever set foot in, the quick up and down, the barely hidden surprise. Hyunwoo didn't give her that look. He handed her wraps for her hands and told her, without a trace of performance, that she didn't need to change a single thing about herself to be here, that this wasn't about fixing anything, and if she wanted to learn to hit something, he'd teach her properly or not at all. It undid her a little, standing in that gym, to be told by a man who worked out 2 hours a day that her body wasn't a problem to be solved. She kept coming back anyway, not because she needed his permission to exist in her own skin, but because for the first time in years, moving her body felt like something she was doing for herself instead of an apology she owed the room. Hyunwoo taught her to throw a real punch, correcting her stance with 2 fingers instead of grabbing her the way other trainers might have, and the ease between them deepened week by week into something that felt less like recovery and more like friendship, the kind Imani hadn't let herself have room for in years of managing Julian's image alongside her own. She started seeing a therapist around the same time she started going to that gym, a decision Denise had pushed for gently and Imani had resisted for weeks, telling herself she didn't need to pay someone to hear what she already knew, that Julian had hurt her, that she'd survive it, that plenty of women survived worse. It was Hyunwoo, oddly, who finally tipped her toward the appointment, mentioning offhand one evening that even he kept a standing session every other week, that a life spent managing violence and grief without ever unpacking any of it eventually cost more than the hour it took to sit with someone trained to help carry it. The sessions were slow-going at first, circling the same ballroom, the same microphone, the same 10 years of small erasures she'd trained herself not to notice while they were happening. Her therapist asked her once, gently, how long she'd been apologizing for taking up space before Julian ever gave her a reason to, and Imani sat with that question for the rest of the week, turning it over the way she once turned over Julian's compliments, looking for the catch in it, and finding, this time, only truth. She had been shrinking herself in small, invisible ways since long before that ballroom, tailoring her laugh, her opinions, the portions on her own plate, to whatever size felt safest to occupy in whatever room she happened to be standing in. Unlearning that took longer than any of the visible parts of her healing, longer than the divorce, longer than the alley, longer even than falling in love again. But she noticed it happening in small ways, in how she ordered exactly what she wanted at dinner without calculating anyone else's reaction first, in how she stopped angling her body away from cameras at her own events, in how she finally, one ordinary Tuesday, caught herself laughing loudly enough to turn heads across a restaurant and felt no urge at all to make herself smaller in response. Not every morning in that gym went smoothly. There was a Tuesday, 6 weeks in, when a client meeting ran long and Imani showed up frustrated and low, having spent the previous hour listening to a bride's mother suggest, delicately, that perhaps Imani should be the one standing at the back of the ceremony photos rather than the front, out of consideration for how the pictures would look. She threw punches that morning like she was trying to put someone specific through the bag, and Hyunwoo let her, holding the pads steady and silent until she finally stopped, breathing hard, tears she hadn't given herself permission to cry in front of the bride's mother, finally arriving 3 hours late and in the wrong room entirely. He didn't tell her the mother was wrong the way Julian used to, with a reassurance that always somehow circled back to his own comfort. He asked her, instead, what she wanted to do about it, and when she admitted she didn't know if she had the energy to fire a client over one comment, he simply said that was her decision to make, and he'd back whichever one she chose. She fired the client 2 days later anyway, and rebuilt the wedding's design for a replacement client within a week, and the version of herself that walked out of that meeting felt entirely unfamiliar to the woman who'd spent a decade smoothing over exactly this kind of comment for Julian's sake. It was around then that she started noticing how carefully Hyunwoo built his own days, blocks of discipline stacked one on top of another, training before dawn, meetings before most of Atlanta woke up, a stillness to him that read as control rather than rigidity. Imani got the chance to return the steadiness he'd given her sooner than she expected, though not until later that year. She asked him once why he pushed himself so hard, and he told her, with the same flat honesty he used for everything, that discipline was the only thing that had ever kept him alive in a world that would have used any softness against him the moment it found it. He wasn't performing strength for anyone watching. He needed it, the way other men needed air. She understood that better than she expected to. She had spent 10 years performing softness for a man who used every ounce of it against her eventually, and something about watching Hyunwoo build his strength as armor instead of decoration made her want to build some of her own. Not to match him, not to earn a place beside him, but because she was tired of being the only unguarded thing in every room she walked into. It was in that gym 4 weeks after the alley that she finally asked him what he actually did. He told her the truth in pieces, the way men like him always did, admitting first to the nightclubs and the investment firm that carried his name legitimately across 3 cities, and only when she pressed did he admit, quietly, that not everything under the Onyx Group's umbrella would survive a federal audit. He watched her carefully when he said it, like he expected her to bolt, like every woman before her had. Imani surprised herself by not bolting. She'd spent 10 years married to a man who kept his corruption tucked behind a prosecutor's badge and called it ambition, and there was something almost honest, almost restful, about a man who simply told her what he was and let her decide what to do with it. What she decided, over the weeks that followed, was that she wanted to keep finding out. The twist came from a place she hadn't been watching. Denise called her one night, voice tight, to say a woman claiming to be from the DA's office had come by the old house, asking pointed questions about Imani's whereabouts the night of the divorce dinner. Questions that had nothing to do with a divorce filing and everything to do with the three men in that alley, who it turned out weren't random opportunists at all, but two of them had priors connected to a rival Atlanta crew that had spent the better part of a year trying to muscle into territory the Onyx Group considered its own. Imani hadn't been an accident that night. She'd been collateral, a woman walking alone through a corridor that had already turned into a low-grade war zone between Hyunwoo's people and men trying to test how far his reach really went, and the rescue she'd been so grateful for had also been, from a different angle, Hyunwoo's men doing exactly the kind of routine sweep his organization ran through contested blocks every night. He'd found her by circumstance. He'd kept finding her by choice. Denise was the one who dug up the rest of it, calling in a favor from a paralegal friend at the DA's office who'd overheard two investigators discussing the alley incident by name, connecting it not to Imani at all, but to an open file on organized activity along that stretch of Midtown that predated her divorce by months. It rattled Imani more than she expected, the idea that the worst night of her life had also, to someone else's file folder, been a data point in an ongoing case, one more entry in a ledger that had nothing to do with her heartbreak and everything to do with men fighting over blocks of a city she'd only ever wanted to walk safely through. When she confronted Hyunwoo with it, furious at the version of the story she'd been telling herself for a month, he didn't deny a word of it. He told her plainly that circumstance had put her in that alley, but nothing after that first night had been circumstance, that he'd checked on her because he wanted to, not because guilt required it, and that if she wanted to walk away now, knowing exactly what world he came from, he wouldn't stop her. She asked him, voice shaking, whether he'd have told her any of it himself, ever, if Denise hadn't found it first. He was quiet long enough that she almost left right then. When he finally answered, he admitted he didn't know, that the habit of keeping his world sealed off from anyone he cared about had kept people he loved alive for 15 years, his mother, his sister, two friends from his own reckless 20s who hadn't been so lucky, and that unlearning that instinct wasn't something he knew how to do gracefully, only that he was willing to try, for her, if she gave him the chance to. She almost did. She sat with it for 3 days, the fear of choosing another dangerous man so soon after the last one destroyed her, the fear that she was simply trading one kind of danger for another. But Julian's danger had worn a suit and a smile, and had still gutted her in front of 200 people. Hyunwoo's danger, at least, had never once pretended to be something softer than it was. She went back to the gym on the 4th day, and neither of them mentioned the 3 days apart, and that was answer enough for both of them. The fear didn't disappear entirely, though, and Imani was honest enough with herself to admit it kept resurfacing in smaller ways over the following weeks. She found herself doing the math on his security detail during ordinary dinners, counting exits the way he did without meaning to, flinching at unfamiliar cars idling too long outside her building. She asked, finally, if she could see the parts of his world he usually kept separate from her, not out of morbid curiosity, but because she'd decided she would rather understand exactly what she was choosing than keep flinching at shadows of it. He took her, one Sunday afternoon, to the warehouse district south of downtown, where the Onyx Group's legitimate holdings sat, a logistics company, a small chain of laundromats, a restaurant supply distributor, businesses so ordinary they felt almost anticlimactic set against everything her imagination had built up. He showed her the ledgers, explained without flinching which parts of the empire were exactly what they appeared to be, and which parts existed to move money that had nowhere honest to go, and answered every question she asked without softening a single detail for her comfort. What struck her most wasn't the danger of it, which she'd already glimpsed in an alley and would later meet again in a parking garage. It was the loneliness underneath the danger. The way Hyun-woo had built an empire designed to protect people. His mother back in Seoul. His younger sister finishing university in Boston. The men who'd worked for his father before him, while keeping almost no one close enough to see the whole shape of it. He told her that was the part of this life he was most tired of, not the violence, which he'd made a kind of peace with years ago, but the isolation, the habit of loving people from a careful distance so nothing he was could ever touch them directly. Imani understood that kind of loneliness better than she wanted to admit. She had spent 10 years standing beside Julian in rooms full of people and had never once felt as unseen as she had on the nights he came home late, smelling faintly of someone else's perfume, and told her, without looking up, that nothing was wrong. Loneliness inside a marriage and loneliness inside an empire, she was starting to realize, wore the same face when you looked closely enough. She told him, standing in that unglamorous warehouse full of ordinary ledgers and extraordinary secrets, that she wasn't afraid of what he was. She was afraid of choosing wrong again, of missing the signs a second time the way she'd apparently missed them with Julian for years. Hyun-woo told her, quietly, that the difference between the two men wasn't hard to find if she looked for it. Julian had hidden his true self behind a mask of respectability that fooled an entire city. Hyun-woo had simply shown her his mask first, the danger up front instead of buried, and let her decide from there whether she wanted to stay. She decided, standing among crates of restaurant napkins that doubled as cover for a fortune neither of them ever discussed in specifics again, that she did. The lesson she was learning, slowly, without either of them naming it out loud, was that she had spent a decade shrinking pieces of herself to fit into rooms Julian built, and healing didn't look like finding a man who'd let her stay small. It looked like finding one who had never once asked her to be smaller in the first place, and then choosing, on her own terms and in her own time, whether she wanted to build something with him. The threat against her came 4 months into their friendship, on a night Hyun-woo had specifically asked her to skip a charity dinner he was attending, a request he'd never made before and one she ignored out of stubbornness more than curiosity. She arrived to find the same rival crew that had been testing his territory for months had used the cover of a public event to make a point, cornering her in the parking garage the moment she stepped out of her car, close enough this time that Hyun-woo's men weren't already stationed to intervene. She didn't freeze the way she had in that first alley. Months of mornings in his gym had put something steady into her hands, and when the nearest man grabbed her arm, she broke his grip exactly the way Hyun-woo had drilled into her a dozen times, hard enough to buy herself 3 seconds, which turned out to be exactly as long as she needed before Hyun-woo himself came around the concrete pillar at a dead run, calm gone from his face for the first time since she'd known him. What happened in that garage over the next 90 seconds told her everything about the world he moved through that his careful explanations never had. Hyun-woo moved differently than she'd ever seen him move in the gym, faster, colder, every motion stripped down to whatever it needed to accomplish and nothing else, and the 4 men who had cornered her against a concrete pillar were on the ground or gone before Imani's own hands had stopped shaking from the one she'd fought off herself. It also told her, watching him put himself bodily between her and 4 armed men, without a moment's hesitation, exactly how far he was willing to go for a woman he'd never once called anything more than a friend. He knelt in front of her afterward, checking her arms, her ribs, the side of her face where the first man's grip had left a mark already darkening under her skin, and his hands were shaking too, she realized, in a way she'd never once seen from him. Not in the alley 8 months earlier, not in any of the calm, careful conversations since. His men had the rival crew's leader in custody within the hour, a man named Choi who ran the operation that had spent nearly a year testing the edges of Hyun-woo's territory, and what he confessed under Hyun-woo's questioning gave the twist its final, uglier shape. The garage attack hadn't been ordered by Choi's own ambitions at all. Someone outside the Atlanta underworld entirely had paid for the information about Imani's schedule and the charity dinner she'd be attending alone. someone with resources deep enough to reach into a rival crew and rent their muscle for a single night's message, and when Hyunwoo finally traced the money 3 days later, it led back through 2 shell accounts to a donor fund quietly controlled by Julian Cross's campaign. Julian hadn't ordered anyone to hurt her. Not directly. Choi insisted under pressure that left little room for lying. He'd only wanted her frightened enough, isolated enough, that word would spread through the city that Baek Hyun-woo couldn't even protect the woman on his arm, a rumor calculated to weaken Hyun-woo's standing in exactly the rooms where Julian needed donors to start doubting the competition's power. Julian had turned her fear into a campaign strategy, the same way he'd once turned her body into a stump speech, and Imani sat with that discovery for a long time before she finally understood that it didn't surprise her at all. Hyun-woo wanted to handle Choi's shell accounts quietly, through channels that had nothing to do with courts or headlines, but the federal task force already circling the Onyx Group had apparently been tracing the same money for reasons entirely their own, and within days, 2 agents showed up at the club asking questions that made clear the investigation into Hyun-woo's business had been active for far longer than either of them realized. He warned Imani plainly that this meant the ground under both of them might get harder before it got easier, that an investigation this size rarely stayed contained to the people it was actually built to catch, and that her name, now attached to his, might end up dragged through exactly the kind of headlines she'd spent her whole life avoiding. Imani told him she'd rather stand in the middle of an honest storm than spend one more year pretending a false calm was safety, which was, she realized as she said it out loud, the truest thing she'd understood about her first marriage in a decade of living inside it. Neither of them called it a friendship after that night. He didn't touch her that night in the garage beyond checking her arms and hands for injury, careful and clinical even with his own pulse still visibly hammering in his throat, and it was that restraint, more than the fight itself, that told Imani everything she needed to know about what she'd become to him. He drove her home himself instead of sending a driver, and neither of them spoke for most of the ride, the adrenaline slowly draining out of the car and leaving something quieter and more dangerous in its place. At her door, he finally said what he'd apparently been holding back for months, that he had told himself for a long time this was friendship because she deserved time after Julian, deserved to choose a man for herself instead of falling into the arms of the first one who was kind to her, and that he had meant to keep giving her that time until she was ready to ask for something more, if she ever wanted to at all. Watching her break a man's grip in a parking garage using the exact technique he'd taught her, watching her stand and fight instead of freezing the way she had in that first alley, had apparently broken whatever restraint he had left. Imani told him, standing on her own porch with her hands still shaking from the fight, that she was done waiting to deserve things. She had spent a decade waiting to deserve Julian's approval and gotten a divorce announced over a microphone for her trouble. She was not interested in waiting any longer for a life she already wanted. He proposed 3 weeks later, not with a speech or an audience, but on an ordinary Tuesday morning in the gym, both of them sweating through the end of a session, when he simply stopped mid-drill, pulled a small box out of his gym bag like he'd been carrying it around for exactly this kind of unglamorous moment, and told her that he did not want to spend one more morning training beside a woman he wasn't allowed to call his wife. Imani laughed so hard she had to sit down on the mat, ring still unopened in his outstretched hand, because it was, without question, the least romantic proposal she had ever heard of, and somehow the only one that had ever actually felt true. Denise cried harder over the engagement than she had over the divorce, which she pointed out herself, half laughing, half serious, sitting on Imani's bed the night Imani finally sat her down and told her everything, the alley's real cause, the warehouse full of ledgers, the parts of Hyunwoo's world that would never fully wash clean. Denise listened without interrupting, the same way Hyunwoo always did, and when Imani finished, braced for worry or warning, Denise only asked one question, whether Imani felt safer with this man than she'd ever felt with Julian. The answer came without hesitation, and Denise hugged her sister so tightly Imani nearly lost her balance, and that was, in its own way, the only blessing Imani had needed. They married 8 months later, in a ceremony small enough to fit in the private courtyard behind his club. No press, no political donors, no 200 strangers weighing her worth from linen-covered tables. Denise stood beside her. Hyunwoo's younger sister Mira flew in from Boston a full week before the wedding, ostensibly to help with preparations but mostly, Imani suspected, to size up the woman her brother had chosen. Mira was 24, sharp-tongued and unguarded in a way her brother almost never allowed himself to be, and she spent that week trailing Imani through dress fittings and flower orders, peppering her with questions that had nothing to do with the wedding at all, what she wanted for her own company, whether she planned to keep working once she married into the family, whether she understood what she was signing up for beyond the danger everyone already whispered about. By the 3rd day, Mira had stopped interrogating and started simply talking, telling Imani stories about their father, about the version of Hyunwoo that had existed before their father's death forced him into a role he'd never asked for at 23, about the girlfriends who'd come before Imani and left the moment the danger stopped feeling like an adventure and started feeling like a life. Mira told her, plainly, over coffee on the 4th morning, that she'd watched her brother build careful, controlled distance around every relationship he'd ever had, and that she had never once seen him let someone stand as close to him as he let Imani stand, not even family. It was Mira who cried hardest at the wedding itself, harder even than Denise, and who pulled Imani aside afterward to tell her that she finally, for the first time since their father died, felt like her brother had someone in his corner who wasn't there because of what the Beck name could offer them. Hyunwoo's mother, flown in from Seoul, held Imani's hands before the ceremony and told her, through a translator, that her son had not smiled like this in 15 years, and that whatever Imani had done to put that smile there, she should never stop doing it. His mother had arrived 3 days early, insisting on meeting the woman her son had chosen before the wedding itself, and had spent an entire afternoon in Imani's kitchen, teaching her to make mandu from scratch, hands folding dumplings with the quick, practiced economy of decades, pausing only to correct Imani's technique, or to ask, through the same patient translator, pointed questions about her business, her family, and whether she understood exactly what she was marrying into. Imani answered honestly every time, and by the end of the afternoon, flour dusted across both their aprons. Hyunwoo's mother had declared, without translation this time, that Imani would do just fine, a verdict Hyunwoo later told her mattered more than any blessing a priest could have offered. The ceremony itself was brief and unadorned, a single string musician instead of a quartet, candlelight instead of chandeliers, vows that neither of them had written to impress an audience because for once, there wasn't one to impress. Hyunwoo promised her, plainly, that he would never again let his world touch her without warning, that whatever needed to be hidden from her before would be hidden no longer, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life making sure she never again stood in a room wondering if she was loved for the right reasons. Imani promised him, in turn, that she would stop apologizing for the space she took up, in rooms or in his life, and that she intended to build both of them a home, steady enough to survive whatever his world eventually threw at it. Julian tried to crash it. He showed up at the courtyard gate 20 minutes before the ceremony, uninvited, claiming he'd only just heard and wanted, absurdly, to offer his blessing, though the tight, calculating look on his face said the visit had more to do with the political optics of his ex-wife marrying a man whose name carried real money and real danger in this city. Hyunwoo's men turned him away at the gate without a hand ever being laid on him, and Imani, watching from the window of the room where she was getting dressed, felt nothing at the sight of him but a small, clean relief that his face no longer had the power to undo her. She married Hyunwoo in a dress the color of the emerald one she'd worn the night everything fell apart, chosen on purpose, worn like a reclamation instead of a wound, and when he lifted her veil his hands were as steady as they'd been in that alley 11 months earlier, and the look on his face held nothing but certainty. For a year, Life settled into something Imani hadn't let herself imagine was still possible. Her event company grew past anything she'd built under Julian's name, not because Hyunwoo's money propped it up, but because for the first time she was designing rooms as a woman who believed she belonged in them, and clients felt the difference in every detail. Word spread through Atlanta's social circuit that Imani Baik didn't just plan a room, she built the kind of room where every guest, regardless of size or standing, felt like the most important person in it, and the irony of that reputation, built directly out of the wound Julian had opened in her, wasn't lost on her. A young bride named Keisha came to her that spring. Plus size and visibly bracing for the same conversation Imani had once dreaded from every wedding vendor she'd ever hired for other people's events. The gentle suggestion that certain necklines or certain seating arrangements might be more flattering, more forgiving, more anything other than exactly what Keisha actually wanted. Imani watched the girl brace for it across her own consultation table and recognized the posture immediately, because she had spent a decade holding her own shoulders in exactly that shape. She didn't give Keisha the conversation she was braced for. She asked her instead what she'd always dreamed her wedding would look like, before anyone else's opinion of her body had gotten a vote in the matter, and spent the next 2 hours designing a day built entirely around Keisha's own answer instead of anyone's idea of what a bride her size was allowed to want. Keisha cried in that consultation, the good kind of crying, and told Imani afterward that nobody in 8 months of wedding planning had once asked her that question first. Imani thought about that a lot in the weeks after, how much of her own healing had happened the same way, one person finally asking what she wanted instead of managing what she was allowed to have, and understood that whatever she built for the rest of her career, she wanted every client who sat across that table from her to leave believing their body had never been the problem the world kept insisting it was. Hyunwoo's world stayed dangerous in ways she learned to live alongside rather than ignore. Late-night calls he took in another room, security details that shadowed her more closely on certain weeks than others, a locked drawer in his study she never asked about and he never offered to explain, but none of it ever touched the steadiness underneath it, the daily proof that he had built a life with her, not around a version of her he wished existed instead. He learned her coffee order without being told twice. He cleared his mornings without complaint whenever a client emergency needed her attention before dawn. He never once, in a full year of marriage, commented on what she ate, how she dressed, or how a photograph of the two of them together might read to anyone watching, and it took Imani nearly that whole year to stop bracing for the comment that never came. 10 months into their marriage, Imani got the chance to return the steadiness he'd given her 100 times over. A call came in at 2 a.m. that Hyunwoo took in the hallway with his voice pitched low and careful, and when he came back to bed, his face had a stillness to it Imani had never seen outside of the parking garage, worse, somehow, for how quiet it was. One of the men who'd worked for his father since before Hyunwoo was born, a man he called uncle though they shared no blood, had been killed that night in a dispute 2 states away that had nothing to do with Atlanta at all, collateral in someone else's war, the same careless way Imani herself had once nearly become collateral in his. He didn't cry, not in front of her, not that night. He sat on the edge of their bed with his hands loosely clasped and told her, in a voice stripped of all its usual control, that he'd spent so many years building walls to keep grief like this contained that he no longer knew how to let anyone stand inside them with him. Imani didn't offer him advice or comfort dressed up as wisdom. She simply sat down beside him, took his hand the same way he'd once taken hers outside a stranger's alley, and stayed there in silence until the sun came up, present in the only way that actually mattered. He told her afterward, once the funeral had passed and life had folded itself back into its usual shape, that it was the first time in 15 years he'd let another person witness him break, and that he hadn't realized how much weight he'd been carrying alone until someone finally helped him set a fraction of it down. It wasn't a rescue the way the alley had been. It was quieter than that, and in some ways it mattered more, because it told them both that whatever they'd built together ran in 2 directions instead of 1. She still thought about Julian sometimes, not with longing, but with the particular clarity of someone studying an old wound from a safe distance. His campaign had continued climbing through that year, polling numbers Denise sent her screenshots of, with a string of angry emojis Imani mostly ignored, and Imani found she could read his name in a headline now without her stomach dropping the way it once had, could see his face on a yard sign without feeling the ghost of that microphone in her ears. That, she understood eventually, was the actual victory, not his downfall, but her own indifference to whether it ever came. The gala, when it came, was his idea entirely, an annual event the Onyx Group threw each spring for the charitable foundation that laundered exactly as much goodwill as money, and Imani had spent 6 weeks designing it herself, top to bottom, the way she once designed Julian's anniversary dinner, except this time every choice in the room was hers and hers alone, and this time she walked into it on Hyunwoo's arm instead of standing alone in the wreckage of someone else's announcement. She caught herself, 3 days before the event, standing in the middle of the same kind of ballroom that had once ended her first marriage, running her hands along a table she'd dressed in deep gold instead of the ivory Julian always preferred, and feeling a tightness in her chest she hadn't expected. Hyunwoo found her there, asked what was wrong, and she admitted, a little embarrassed by it, that some old, stubborn part of her was braced for this room to hurt her too, simply because the last room like it had. He didn't tell her that was ridiculous, and he didn't rush to promise her nothing bad would happen, because they both knew by then that his world didn't come with guarantees like that. Instead, he told her that whatever happened in that room, she wouldn't be standing in it alone this time, and that the difference between the 2 nights had never actually been the size of the ballroom or the guest list. It had been who was standing beside her when the room turned dangerous. She held on to that on the night of the gala the way she'd once held on to her seating chart, a small, practical anchor against a much bigger fear. Imani spent the morning of the gala the way she'd spent every big morning since starting her own company, walking the room alone before anyone else arrived, checking each table by hand instead of trusting the diagrams, and found herself, unexpectedly, near tears over a small gold placard reading Bake Events, the new name she'd given her company 6 months earlier once she'd finally let herself stop hiding behind Rousseau Designs, the name Julian had insisted photographed better for his campaign materials. She had built an entire career around helping other people's biggest nights go perfectly, and it had taken her a decade to build one with her own name on it that she was proud to stand behind. The dress she chose that night wasn't the emerald of her wedding or the humiliation of that first anniversary dinner, but a deep gold that matched the room itself, cut to fit the body she actually had, instead of one she was still, in some quiet corner of herself, apologizing for. She caught her own reflection in the ballroom's tall windows before the doors opened and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply saw a woman who looked exactly as good as she felt. The night arrived warm and clear, 300 guests moving through a room lit gold and low, Imani's design work drawing quiet compliments from women who would once have crossed a room to avoid standing near her, and for the first 2 hours it felt, almost dizzyingly, like the celebration it was supposed to be. Julian arrived uninvited again, this time with a press credential he'd talked his way into, his gubernatorial campaign 3 months from its primary, and desperate enough for donor exposure that he'd apparently decided crashing his ex-wife's husband's gala was worth the risk. Vanessa was with him, thinner and colder than Imani remembered, dressed once again in white in a way that felt, to Imani, less like a coincidence than a costume Vanessa had never learned to take off. The two of them worked the room for exactly 11 minutes, Julian's donor smile fixed in place as he shook hands he had no real claim to be shaking, before Hyunwoo's head of security quietly informed him his credential had already been flagged as fraudulent. Julian didn't leave quietly. He never had. He found Imani first, cutting through a knot of guests near the dessert table with the same practiced ease he'd once used to work a courtroom, and told her, low enough that only their small circle could hear, that he'd heard she'd landed on her feet, that he was glad, genuinely, that some good had come out of what he called, without a trace of irony, a difficult chapter for both of them. Imani didn't flinch the way the old version of her might have. She told him, evenly, that she hoped his campaign was going well, and watched something flicker behind his eyes when he realized the sentence carried no bitterness in it at all. No opening for the apology he'd apparently decided, 18 months too late, that he finally owed her. That composure seemed to be what finally cracked him. He raised his voice then, the same trick that had worked so well on her a year and a half earlier, accusing Hyunwoo publicly of being exactly what half of Atlanta already whispered he was, banking on the room's fear of scandal to force an exit on his own terms instead of securities, his voice carrying easily over the string quartet toward the cluster of reporters he'd made sure were standing close enough to hear. What Julian didn't know, because his campaign's opposition research had been sloppier than he could afford, was that the same federal prosecutors circling the Onyx Group for 18 months had spent the last 6 of them quietly building a parallel case against a district attorney's office accused of burying evidence in exchange for campaign contributions, cases that traced, line by line, straight back to Julian Cross. Hyunwoo hadn't planned to expose it that night. He told Imani later he'd meant to let the investigation run its slow, legal course. But watching Julian stand in the middle of a room Imani had built, trying one more time to humiliate her in front of a crowd, something in him decided the slow course could wait one more day. He nodded once to a man standing near the projector screen behind the stage, and the charity gala's welcome slideshow cut, mid-loop, to a single slide that hadn't been part of Imani's design at all. A slide showing wire transfer records between Julian Cross's campaign account and 3 cases his office had quietly declined to prosecute. The room that had once watched Julian humiliate his wife over a microphone now watched him get escorted out by actual federal agents who had, it turned out, been working the gala as cover for over a month, waiting for exactly the kind of public misstep an ambitious, cornered man was bound to make. Julian's voice cracked halfway through his own protest, the practiced calm finally abandoning him entirely, and for one brief, involuntary second his eyes found Imani's across the room, the way they had never once found them across the ballroom 18 months earlier, looking for some acknowledgement, some flicker of the woman who used to soften every room for him. She gave him nothing, not cruelty, not satisfaction, just the same steady, unreadable calm she'd built one gym session and one job and one quiet Thursday dinner at a time, and it was, she understood later, the single most devastating thing she could have offered him. The room didn't return to celebration easily. Guests clustered in low, urgent knots near the bar, phones already lighting up with the first wire alerts about a sitting district attorney's arrest, and Imani watched women who had once crossed ballrooms to avoid standing near her, now watching her with an entirely different kind of attention, equal parts pity for what she'd once endured and awe at the quiet, devastating precision of the reversal they'd just witnessed. She didn't perform for any of it. She simply asked the string quartet to keep playing, nodded to her catering staff to keep the dessert course moving, and finished hosting her own gala the way she'd have finished hosting anyone else's, because the room, however it had just been upended, was still hers to run. Vanessa didn't wait to be escorted. She left the moment the slide appeared, moving fast through a side door with the practiced ease of a woman who had clearly planned an exit strategy well in advance, and Imani would learn afterward that Vanessa had spent the last year feeding information to both sides, Julian's campaign and the federal investigation into it, protecting herself the only way people like her ever did, by belonging fully to no one. She was never charged with anything more than the immunity deal her cooperation had already purchased her, a small, unsatisfying footnote to a story that had once tried to make her the center of it. Julian's trial stretched across the following year. Plastered across headlines Imani mostly let Denise summarize for her, rather than reading in full, a campaign that collapsed within a week of the gala, a law license suspended and eventually revoked, a plea deal that traded a longer sentence for cooperation of his own against 2 judges he'd spent years quietly buying. Choi, for his part, disappeared into a federal witness protection arrangement Hyun-woo never spoke of again once the paperwork cleared, the rival crew he'd led folding quietly into the vacuum his absence left behind, one more contested block of the city settling, for now, into an uneasy peace. Imani didn't attend a single day of Julian's trial. She sent Denise in her place, once, to hear the verdict read aloud, not because she needed the closure of watching him sentenced, but because some curious, healed part of her wanted the record to exist, plainly, that he had answered for what he'd built. When Denise called afterward to tell her the number of years, Imani felt the same small, clean nothing she'd felt watching him escorted out of her gala, and understood, finally, that the nothing itself was the whole point. Imani didn't celebrate his arrest the way some part of her once imagined she would. Watching Julian dragged out of a room in handcuffs didn't undo the microphone, didn't undo the decade of small erasures that had come before it, and she understood, standing there in a dress she'd chosen for herself in a room she'd built for herself, that the justice happening in front of her wasn't really about her at all anymore. It was Julian's own corruption catching up to him on its own timeline, and she had simply, finally, stopped needing his downfall to feel like her own worth. Hyun-woo found her by the windows afterward, the party slowly reassembling itself into low, astonished conversation behind them, and asked if she was all right. She told him the truth, that she was better than all right, that somewhere in the last year and a half she'd stopped waiting for someone else's ending to decide how her own story went, and that watching Julian finally answer for what he'd built had felt less like revenge and more like a door closing on a room she'd already walked out of a long time ago. He took her hand, the same steady grip from the alley, from the wedding, from the parking garage, and told her that he'd fallen in love with her the night she refused to let 3 strangers or one bad marriage decide who she was allowed to be, and that everything since had only ever been him trying to build a life worthy of that woman. Hyun-woo's mother called from Seoul before the gala guests had even fully cleared the room, having heard the news already through whatever channels reached her fastest, and told Imani, through Mira's translation over speakerphone, that she was proud, not of the exposure or the arrest, but of the steadiness Imani had shown standing in the middle of it, hosting her own event through a scandal instead of letting the scandal host itself through her. It was a small thing, a phone call across an ocean, but it landed somewhere deep in Imani, the particular ache of being told, by a mother who wasn't hers by blood, that she'd done something worth being proud of. Denise found her an hour later, mascara slightly smudged from laughing too hard at something one of Hyun-woo's aunts had said, and pulled her sister into the kind of hug that needed no explanation, the two of them standing at the edge of a gold-lit room that had once been the site of Imani's worst night and was now, unmistakably, hers. In the weeks that followed, Imani found herself back in front of a mirror more often than she expected, not out of old habit, but out of something closer to curiosity, studying a woman she was still, in some ways, getting reacquainted with. The Keisha wedding happened that same summer, a small backyard ceremony Imani designed exactly the way the bride had first described it in that consultation. No forgiving necklines, no strategically hidden seating, just a joyful, unapologetic celebration of a marriage between two people who had never once asked Keisha to be smaller. Keisha hugged her at the end of the night and told her, through happy tears, that she hoped one day to build the kind of marriage Imani clearly had, unaware that Imani had spent the drive over, fighting back tears of her own, watching a stranger receive the exact permission it had taken her a divorce, an alley, and a year of gym mornings to finally give herself. She didn't find a body that had been fixed or transformed into something smaller and more acceptable. She found the same body that had walked barefoot through Midtown at midnight, the same body Julian had once stood in front of 200 people and called a liability, and she understood, finally and completely, that nothing about that body had ever needed fixing at all. What had needed to change was every room she let define its worth for her. She still went to therapy every other week, the same standing appointment Hyun-woo kept, and had started, over the past year, to notice the difference it made in how she moved through the rest of her life, less bracing, less apologizing, more room, finally, to simply exist without managing everyone else's comfort around her existence first. Her therapist told her once that healing rarely looked like a single dramatic turning point. More often, it looked like 100 small refusals, stacked one on top of another, refusing to shrink her plate, refusing to angle away from a camera, refusing to let a man's cruelty in a ballroom define the rest of her story. And Imani understood, looking back over the last 2 years, that the 100 small refusals had added up to exactly the life she was living now. She kept the gym membership. She kept Thursday dinners, though they'd long since stopped needing a reservation anywhere without cameras, since she'd stopped caring whether anyone photographed her plate. She built her company into the kind of name people whispered with respect instead of pity, and she built her marriage, morning by unglamorous morning, into the kind of steady, unconditional thing she hadn't believed still existed for a woman who looked like her, in a city that had once tried so hard to convince her it didn't. Sometimes, on ordinary Thursday nights, she and Hyun-woo still drove to the same unpretentious restaurant where he'd first asked her, without preamble, whether she'd eaten dinner, and sat in the same corner booth reviewing nothing more dramatic than the week's small victories and small frustrations, her business, his legitimate ventures, Mira's latest phone call from Boston, his mother's newest instructions relayed across an ocean. It was, on the surface, an unremarkable ritual, 2 people sharing an unremarkable meal, and it had become, for Imani, the single clearest proof that the life she'd built after that ballroom wasn't a rescue story at all. It was simply, finally, a life built by a woman who had decided, one refusal at a time, that she deserved the whole of it. Imani Rousseau married a man who never once asked her to be smaller, and built, with him, exactly the kind of room she'd spent her whole career designing for other people, one where she finally, fully belonged. If you needed a reminder tonight that the right person will never ask you to shrink, hit like right now. That's you telling this platform that stories like Imani's deserve to reach more women who need to hear this. Subscribe before you go, because Beck and Imani's world isn't done yet, and you don't want to miss what's coming for them next. And if there's a woman in your life who's ever been made to feel like too much, send her this story tonight. Sometimes the reminder that she's already enough is the whole point.